If you looked at a map of the Italian peninsula in the early 19th century, you would not find a country. You would find a mosaic of borders, a collection of disconnected states living under the long, cold shadows of foreign powers. From the northern peaks down to the southern shores, the land was carved into pieces. Lombardy and Venetia answered to distant emperors. The Papal States held the center with ancient, rigid authority. In the south, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies operated under its own isolated orbit, while the Kingdom of Sardinia clung to the northwest. This was not a nation. It was a territory held in check by treaties signed in foreign capitals. Travelers crossed borders every few miles, paying tolls to different masters, speaking dialects that shifted with the wind. Soil's shared history birthed the unified state, but it remained buried beneath layers of administrative control and military occupation. The map was a puzzle, but the pieces were held by hands that did not want them to fit together. In 1815, the diplomats gathered in Vienna to put the world back together after the storm of Napoleon. They did not see a peninsula of people. They saw a chessboard. With precise strokes of a quill, they redrew the map of Italy to suit the balance of power in Europe. Austria tightened its grip, locking Lombardy and Venetia into a permanent embrace. The Papal States were restored to the center, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was returned to its former rulers. The ink dried, and with it, the hope for a unified future seemed to vanish. The new borders were reinforced by treaties and backed by the promise of military intervention. In the streets of Milan and the squares of Naples, the news arrived not as a celebration, but as a sentence. The foreign garrisons increased their patrols, and the local administrators enforced laws that felt increasingly alien. Yet, the very rigidity of this new order created a new kind of friction. People watched the border markers being moved and felt the weight of their own exclusion. The silence in the taverns and the hushed conversations in the piazzas were not signs of acceptance. They were the first tremors of a deep, simmering resentment. The architects of the Congress thought they had restored the old order, but they had only succeeded in compressing the spirit of the people into a smaller, more volatile space. The rigidity of the post-Vienna order could not contain the ideas that had already taken root. During the Napoleonic era, administrative reforms had introduced new ways of governance and a taste for meritocracy that did not simply vanish when the old kings returned. Enlightenment ideals, once confined to the salons of the elite, began to seep into the broader consciousness of the urban middle class. Lawyers, merchants, and students started to question the legitimacy of foreign rule. They read the works of philosophers who spoke of liberty and the rights of citizens, and they applied these concepts to their own fractured land. The movement found its name, the Risorgimento, or the Resurgence. It was not yet a battle cry, but a steady pulse of intellectual defiance. Clandestine printing presses produced pamphlets that circulated under the cover of night, passing from hand to hand in the back rooms of coffeehouses. These texts argued that a people sharing a language and a history deserved a single sovereign state. The seeds of a national identity were being sown, not in the fields, but in the minds of those who refused to accept the map as it had been drawn in Vienna. The shift from debate to action arrived with the Carbonari. In the 1820s and 1830s, these secret societies moved out of the shadows and into the streets. They organized armed uprisings in Naples and Piedmont, aiming to force constitutional change upon the restored monarchs. The air in the piazzas turned sharp with the sound of muskets and the shouting of slogans. For a brief window, the old order trembled, but the reaction was swift and absolute. Austrian bayonets moved south, and local rulers deployed their garrisons with ruthless efficiency. The rebels were outmatched, their supply lines cut, and their leadership scattered. By the time the smoke cleared, the prisons were overflowing, and the leaders were either in exile or facing the gallows. The uprisings were crushed, their immediate goals dismantled by superior force. Yet, the failure did not extinguish the fire. It changed its nature. The trials and the public executions transformed the fallen into symbols. Each name added to the list of martyrs became a rallying point for those who remained. The defeat proved that the desire for change was no longer a fringe sentiment. The failure of the secret societies demanded a new architecture for the movement. Into this void stepped Giuseppe Mazzini, a man who believed that the struggle required more than just clandestine cells. It required a soul. Mazzini rejected the fragmented, localized approach of the past. He argued that Italy could not be liberated by isolated coups, but only through a unified, national awakening. He articulated a vision of a democratic republic, a state where sovereignty resided not in a monarch, but in the people themselves. His words acted as a lightning rod for the disillusioned youth. Mazzini founded Young Italy, a movement that bypassed the old guard and appealed directly to the students and workers. He demanded total commitment, framing the fight for independence as a moral and political necessity. His pamphlets were not merely calls to arms, they were blueprints for a new society. He taught his followers that the nation was a living entity, and that its birth required the collective sacrifice of its citizens. Across the peninsula, his ideas traveled through hidden networks, finding fertile ground in the universities and the workshops. He transformed the concept of the Risorgimento from a series of disjointed protests into a coherent, national crusade. By providing a clear intellectual goal, Mazzini gave the movement a sense of inevitability. The focus shifted from the tactical failures of the 1820s to a long-term strategy of education and agitation. He ensured that even as the authorities tightened their grip, the next generation was already being forged in the furnace of his Republican ideals. While Mazzini provided the ideological fire, his vision lacked the levers of state power. The movement needed more than pamphlets. It required an army, a treasury, and a seat at the table of European powers. Enter Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour. He viewed the dream of a unified Italy not through the lens of romantic insurrection, but through the cold, calculated mechanics of diplomacy. Cavour occupied the office of Prime Minister in the Kingdom of Sardinia, and he immediately set to work dismantling the old, reactive policies. He understood that Austria would never be evicted by barricades alone. Instead, he turned the Kingdom of Sardinia into a modern, industrialized state, building railways and expanding trade to gain the attention of the great powers. He played the European chessboard with ruthless precision. Cavour cultivated ties with France and Britain, positioning Sardinia as the indispensable partner in the Mediterranean. He did not ask for revolution. He lobbied for influence. By embedding his nation into the complex web of European alliances, he transformed the Italian question from a domestic nuisance into a matter of international concern. Diplomacy alone could not shatter the status quo. The movement required a blade to cut the Gordian knot of foreign occupation. This was the domain of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Unlike the calculated maneuvers of the cabinet, Garibaldi operated on the pulse of the people. He was a man of action who understood that authority often yielded only to the sight of an armed force. He emerged not as a politician, but as a military catalyst capable of transforming raw, unorganized fervor into a disciplined, fighting machine. Garibaldi possessed an uncanny ability to draw thousands of volunteers to his banner, men who saw in him the embodiment of their national aspirations. He stripped away the pretense of formal warfare, favoring rapid, decisive strikes that caught the ruling powers off guard. He moved with a speed that terrified the old monarchies, turning the countryside into a theater of insurgency. His presence on the field acted as a magnet for the disillusioned, turning passive supporters into active combatants. The movement now faced a dangerous divergence. Garibaldi held the momentum of the sword, while Cavour held the reins of state policy. Without a central authority to bind these forces, the Risorgimento risked fracturing into competing factions. The revolution needed a figurehead capable of commanding the respect of both the radical volunteers and the conservative political establishment. Victor Emmanuel II stepped into this void. He was the king of Sardinia, yet he possessed the political dexterity to transcend his own crown. He understood that a modern nation could not be built on the ruins of absolute monarchy alone, nor could it survive the chaos of unchecked republicanism. He positioned himself as the bridge. By adopting a constitutional framework, he signaled to the liberals that their democratic ideals would be respected, while his royal status reassured the traditional powers that the new state would maintain order. He became the singular point of gravity for the disparate regions. When Garibaldi surrendered his hard-won territories, he did so not to a politician, but to the king, effectively legitimizing the revolution under a unified national banner. Victor Emmanuel II transformed the movement from a series of regional uprisings into a coherent, state-sanctioned endeavor. Under his leadership, the visions merged into a single identity. Despite the internal consolidation of power, the northern territories remained firmly under the shadow of the Austrian Empire. Sardinia lacked the military weight to challenge the Habsburgs alone. Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour, recognized that survival required an external lever. He turned his gaze toward Paris, seeking an alliance with Napoleon III. This was not a negotiation of public treaties, but a calculated, clandestine gamble. Cavour traveled to the resort of Plombiers, meeting the French emperor in total secrecy. The air in the room was thick with the weight of shifting borders and potential casualties. Cavour played a dangerous game, offering territorial concessions in exchange for a French military commitment. He needed to goad Austria into an act of aggression, ensuring that France would be bound by treaty to intervene on the side of Sardinia. Napoleon III, driven by his own ambitions to reshape European influence, agreed to the terms. They mapped out a future conflict that would inevitably bleed across the plains of Lombardy. This secret pact transformed the political landscape overnight. Cavour returned to Turin with the promise of French bayonets, effectively turning the diplomatic tide against the Austrian grip. The strategy was clear: provoke the enemy. The diplomatic trap snapped shut with the precision of a guillotine. Austria, sensing the encroaching threat, issued an ultimatum demanding the immediate disarmament of the Sardinian forces. Cavour refused. Within hours, the fragile peace of the 19th century dissolved into the smoke of total war. The Second Italian War of Independence had begun. Along the border, the silence of the morning was shattered by the rhythmic, thunderous roar of heavy cannons. Iron shells tore through the air, pulverizing the defensive positions that had held the north in a stranglehold for decades. French battalions marched in lockstep with Sardinian regiments, their combined weight pressing against the imperial front. The ground beneath the soldiers trembled under the relentless barrage. Combat was not a matter of strategy anymore. It was a visceral struggle for every mile of soil. The Austrian lines, once thought impenetrable, began to buckle under the sheer intensity of the assault. Smoke choked the horizon, obscuring the movement of cavalry and infantry as they collided in the muddy fields of Lombardy. The first major breakthrough arrived at the heat of the conflict, as the combined forces punched through the imperial defenses, forcing a chaotic retreat. This was the moment the map of Italy began to tear away from its old masters. The smoke of the battlefield had barely cleared before a different kind of force took hold. It was not the sound of cannons, but the scratching of pens on paper that signaled the true collapse of the old order. Across the liberated northern territories, the machinery of occupation vanished, replaced by the sudden, urgent demand for self-determination. Local committees sprang up in town squares, transforming the chaos of war into the structured process of the plebiscite. Men stood in long, winding lines outside public buildings, waiting for their chance to cast a vote that would define their future. There was no ambiguity in the result. From city centers to remote rural villages, the ballot boxes filled with a singular, overwhelming mandate for union with Sardinia. This was the moment where the abstract ideals of the Risorgimento became tangible law. The momentum was infectious, sweeping from one province to the next like a wildfire. Every successful vote stripped away another layer of the Austrian legacy, leaving the old imperial governors with no authority to command. The plebiscites had achieved what armies alone could not. They provided the moral and legal legitimacy for a nation that was now beginning to breathe on its own. While the north solidified its borders, the focus of the revolution shifted abruptly to the southern coast. Two steamships cut through the Mediterranean, carrying a volunteer force that defied all conventional military logic. They arrived at the Sicilian port of Marsala under the cover of a chaotic dawn. The landing was not a grand parade, but a desperate, rapid scramble as men jumped into the shallow surf, dragging supplies and rifles onto the sand before the Bourbon naval patrols could react. The local garrison, caught completely off guard by the audacity of the arrival, struggled to organize a defense against an enemy that refused to fight in open lines. The volunteers moved with the speed of a wildfire, utilizing the rugged terrain to bypass fortified positions. They struck at night, hitting supply depots and communication lines. Every village they entered became a recruiting ground, swelling their ranks with locals who had long waited for a signal to rise. The myth of Bourbon invincibility evaporated in the face of this ragtag army, proving that a small, determined force could dismantle a dynasty. The final collapse of the Bourbon regime happened not with a single decisive battle, but with the systematic disintegration of authority. As the volunteer forces pushed toward the capital, the royal administration simply ceased to function. Officials burned records in the courtyards. Military commanders abandoned their posts, leaving gates unlocked and armories wide open. The king retreated into his inner chambers, But the walls could no longer protect a dynasty that had lost the streets. Across the continent, the news of the southern collapse hit like a physical tremor. Diplomatic couriers raced between London, Paris, and Vienna, carrying urgent dispatches that questioned the stability of the entire Mediterranean balance. The established powers, who had spent decades enforcing the status quo, watched in disbelief as a volunteer army dismantled a kingdom in mere months. Meanwhile, in the south, the symbols of the old monarchy were torn down by cheering crowds. Statues were toppled, flags were burned. The Bourbon dynasty had been reduced to a footnote. The old order had been shattered, and the vacuum was being filled by the new national movement. The momentum of the Southern campaign reached its absolute limit at the small town of Tino. Two forces converged on the same road, and for a few hours, the prospect of a fractured nation loomed large. One side represented the revolutionary fire of the volunteers, while the other represented the formal authority of the Northern Kingdom. The air was thick with the uncertainty of what would happen when the two commanders finally met. If the volunteers pushed forward, they risked a civil war that would destroy the dream of a unified state before it could even be born. The decision was made in a brief, quiet encounter. The leader of the volunteers stepped forward and placed his authority into the hands of the monarch. He did not ask for a title, a position, or a reward. He simply acknowledged the necessity of a single, central command. By this act, he effectively dissolved his own military power, folding his forces into the national army. The tension that had gripped the country for months snapped, replaced by the reality of a singular, unified state. The monarch accepted the surrender of the conquered territories, and in that moment, the dream began to coalesce. The city of Turin became the epicenter of a new political reality in early 1861. Delegates arrived from every corner of the peninsula, carrying the mandates of their respective regions to the first national parliament. The atmosphere inside the chamber was heavy with the weight of decades of struggle. When the official proclamation was read, it did not trigger a singular celebration, but a profound sense of gravity. The Kingdom of Italy had been born, a legal entity recognized by the collective will of its people. Yet, as the ink dried on the documents, the map on the wall told a different story. The dream was realized in name, but the geography remained stubbornly incomplete. Venice stood apart under foreign occupation, and the center remained under the Papal States. The delegates looked at the boundaries and understood the limitations of their achievement. The proclamation was a triumph of diplomacy and will, but it was also a starting line for a much longer journey. The cheers in the streets were tempered by the reality of the missing pieces. The nation was now a single house, but the roof was unfinished. The proclamation signaled the beginning of the struggle to make the map match the ambition of the state. The map remained a work in progress, held back by the presence of foreign garrisons and shifting European alliances. The first breakthrough arrived not from within, but from the friction of external powers. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War erupted, forcing a realignment that left the Austrian hold on Venice vulnerable. Italian forces moved to exploit the opening, and the city was formally annexed, removing the northern barrier to total unity. Yet, the heart of the peninsula remained occupied. Rome stood as the final objective, protected by a French garrison that acted as a physical shield for the Papal States. The stalemate persisted until 1870, when the Franco-Prussian War broke out. Napoleon III faced an existential threat at home and ordered the immediate withdrawal of his troops from the city. The protective barrier vanished in an instant. Without the backing of foreign bayonets, the local resistance moved to secure the city. The gates were opened, and the administration of the territory shifted to the central government. With the entry into Rome, the long process of territorial consolidation reached its end. The geographic puzzle was complete, and the peninsula was no longer a collection of disparate states. The ink on the maps had barely dried before the internal fractures began to widen. A single flag now flew over the entire peninsula, but the reality on the ground told a story of two distinct worlds. In the north, factories began to dominate the landscape. Steam engines roared in the valleys, and rail lines connected urban hubs to the markets of Europe. Capital flowed into these centers, fueling a rapid transition toward industrialization. Conversely, the South remained locked in an agrarian cycle that had barely shifted in a century. Large estates relied on manual labor, and the lack of infrastructure kept these regions isolated from the modernizing core. The central government attempted to impose uniform laws, but the economic disparity acted as a barrier that no decree could dismantle. Taxes collected in the north were rarely reinvested in the south, and the southern peasantry found themselves burdened by new costs without the benefit of new technology. This imbalance created a physical and psychological distance that grew with every passing year. The nation was whole on paper, yet it functioned as two separate entities. The central government in the capital issued mandates, but the reality in the provinces was a persistent refusal to comply. Officials sent from the north to administer the south arrived to find their authority ignored. Local leaders held the true power, their influence rooted in centuries of tradition and regional loyalty that the new state could not touch. When tax collectors arrived in rural villages, they were met with locked doors and silent crowds. When the central army attempted to enforce conscription, young men vanished into the hills, choosing local allegiances. They spoke different dialects, followed different customs, and viewed the central government as an intruder. The true challenge was not the map, but the people. We have made Italy, now we must make Italians. The struggle to bridge this gap defined the early years, proving a country is built by the slow alignment of loyalties. The transformation was complete. What began as a collection of disparate territories under foreign influence had hardened into a single, sovereign entity. This was not the work of one man or a single battle, but the result of decades of intellectual pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and military force. The map of Europe had been permanently altered, and the peninsula stood as a unified actor on the global stage. Yet, the legacy of this birth remained layered and heavy. The state had achieved its territorial goal, but the internal process of integration continued to demand resolution. The fervor that fueled the movement left behind a nation-state. That was both a monumental achievement and a work in progress. It stood as a testament to the power of collective will, while simultaneously bearing the scars of the divisions. The unification was the final chapter of a long struggle, but it also served as the opening act for a new, complex era of national development.